Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure, although I can't see you, I can see your names. And so thank you so much for attending today. We'll just wait just maybe one more minute and then we'll get started. We will be recording this session, so if you or your colleague, for example, misses this and would like to watch it again, then by all means, it will be posted on the Faculty of Science website. So hopefully there's no issue with cameras or internet, I should say. And so I guess if you're okay to get started, Dr. Christian, I can, okay, perfect. So, good afternoon to all of you and welcome to On the Menu. This is a new lunch and learn service, or series rather, hosted by the Faculty of Science. My name is Jacqueline Blundell, and I'm the Acting Associate Dean of Science for Research and Graduate Studies and a professor in the Psychology Department. Thank you for joining us here today. On the menu is a full course meal covering a wide variety of topics. In the months ahead, we intend to offer sessions like this, which we hope will be of interest to both faculty and students. So be sure to keep an eye out for news about our next event. We are hoping to give, for faculty members in particular, a tips, I guess, and techniques for applying to the SEED and multidisciplinary grant. And that will happen sometime mid-May, but we'll send out some information about that. We are interested, however, in hearing your ideas. So if you have a suggestion for a future session, please feel free to submit it via the chat function. So you can just post it here on in the chat or email it to science@mun.ca. And maybe Kelly, if you wouldn't mind putting the email in the chat function, if that's possible. So today we are very pleased to feature Dr. Sherri Christian as our inaugural presenter. Dr. Christian received her PhD at the University of British Columbia in immunology, specifically looking at the regulation of single transduction pathways. She then completed postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Memorial University. Currently, Dr. Christian is a very successful associate professor in the Faculty of Sciences Department of Biochemistry. During her postdoctoral training, and as well as early career investigator, she has won a number of awards for platform and poster presentations of her research. This makes her an excellent person to present on today's topic, tips and techniques for effective scientific presentations. Science and technology are everywhere in today's modern lifestyle. In order to make well-informed decisions, we all need to be able to base them on accurate and unbiased information. Scientists are our most direct and knowledgeable source for this information. That means it's critical for us as scientists to be able to inform the public, policymakers, and each other about important information, complex problems, and new discoveries, whether it is to attract attention, funding, or new trainees. We also have a responsibility to share our results in an effective way so as to contribute to the advancement and application of science to others working in the field or those to come, as well as to be able to clear up any miscommunication or misinformation. Those skills are particularly important today. Taking part in competitions such as the 3-minute thesis, your department's research day, or an in-person or virtual conferences are invaluable opportunities to hone these skills, which you'll also need to apply to graduate school or to compete for postdoctoral fellowship positions or faculty jobs, or any job for that matter. Before we begin, I know we've all had lots of opportunities over the past year to participate in virtual talks and lectures. However, to make sure this is a positive experience for everyone, I'd just like to go over a few rules of etiquette. I think you've all done so, but if you haven't, I ask all attendees to please turn off your mics and cameras. The only cameras we would like to have on for the entire event are those of the presenter, Dr. Christian, and mine as host and moderator. It just makes things easier. Following Dr. Christian's presentation, she will be entertaining questions from the audience. I will be monitoring the chat. And if you have a question, please write question in the chat and I'll call on you. If you prefer, however, you could also write your question in the chat and I can read it out and Dr. Christian can then respond, whatever you're more comfortable with. I will remind everyone attending that we are also recording if you missed that at the beginning. And the video will be made public on our website and on YouTube and our YouTube channel in the next few days. So thank you so much for attending, and I'll turn the session now over to Dr. Christian.
And I will unmute. That's the first lesson, always unmute. So you should be able to see my screen as a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, great. So these tips and techniques for effective presentations are based on my own opinions. But I want you to not just listen to me and take my opinion without thinking about it yourself. So if you have a different opinion and you have a good reason for this different opinion, then that's right as well. So there's no real right or wrong for this. If you have formulated your opinions based on like some really good analysis. So, and also this presentation can be downloaded from my website. So if you ever want to go back, you'll find it. Every so often I do update it, so there may be a slightly different version on there than here, but you're more than welcome to it. So Dr. Blundell, thank you for saying all these things. She already said what the important things about giving a talk or a lecture or presentation are. So they're to communicate. They're to communicate ideas and data, expertise. They're also to get awards or good grades or a job. There's a lot of intangibles too that happen when you give a good presentation. A lot of people won't remember what you presented, but they will remember that they thought it was good or they felt good after your presentation. And so it's those, and you never know where those intangibles will lead. The other thing that was already mentioned is that you need to practice. So presenting isn't something that's inherent in most people. Presenting well is actually a learned skill. So you need to present early and often. You need to present at your lab meetings, your journal clubs, at the departmental seminar. We have an annual departmental symposium where we have short talks. It's very, they're short talks, it's low risk. If everything goes badly, then nothing actually happens except for you maybe feel bad for a little while. But it doesn't depend on a grade. Conferences, there's a little bit more high stakes because other people in your field are going to be there, so that can be a little bit more stressful. But anytime you have an opportunity to present at a conference, you should. And then the 3-minute thesis, of course, is a common one. And so in our department, we have all of these opportunities for students to present. And not only that, I give this presentation to all the incoming students. And I think that hearing these kinds of tips and seeing other people's presentations really helps everybody improve. And I'd also say to practice different formats. And this is becoming more difficult actually because formats are changing as we go into this online virtual environment. But just in general, we have posters and slideshows. So before you start making your presentation, you need to know what is your message, who is your audience, and the timing of the presentation. So first we'll talk about the message. You only need 1 to 2 big messages for the entire talk. These messages are the thing that you want your audience to be able to remember a week later. All of the little details, they're probably going to forget. It's not their field, it's not their project. But what is it that you really want them to remember? Keep that in the front of your mind. When you're making your slides, we only want 1 to 2 major points per slide. I'll talk about how to add complexity in a little bit. And note your audience term if it's not on the slide in front of them. If it is important enough to say, then put it on the slide. I just read that out to you. And I read it out to you so we could all read it together because it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Um, you, if you have an important point and you say, please remember this, and then 10 slides later you bring it up, your audience has had to keep track of everything that you've been saying, all the new information, and try to keep that other piece of information in their head. And it is very difficult. So if you really want them to remember something, show it again. And then as the rule for all good communication, you want to tell them what you're going to say, then tell them, and then tell them what you said. And so this is in the, your introduction, your results, and then your conclusions. You need to know your audience. You're a scientist, we're on the Faculty of Science, or presumably many of us are. So do your research. Is this a general public talk? Is this a departmental talk? Is this a research group talk? Any one of those, you're going to have to design your talk slightly differently. Even with a pretty targeted audience, you don't want to assume prior specialized knowledge. This is really hard to know, though, what prior specialized knowledge is. It's going to be very different for a biochemistry department than for a math department. So when in doubt, you assume very smart people who don't know the details. And I have an understanding of basic biology, but of course, if you're in a different field, it would be the basic, maybe undergraduate level or maybe high school level, depending on your audience. And this suggestion has always worked for me. You know, in lots of groups, there's that one person who's asking the difficult questions all the time. And if you can direct your talk towards them, you often answer all of the questions ahead of time. If you don't have a person like that, the other person I like to think about is that new undergraduate student who just joined the lab, who's super bright and super keen, but just doesn't know the field yet. And then you give them the information they need to understand your talk. So this is an example of a slide that I put together for my job talk to get the position that I have. And in a biochemistry department, I should hopefully assume that people understand that DNA goes to mRNA to protein. But if I say, oh, of course, you all understand this, and then somebody doesn't understand it, I've now kind of insulted them. And a big rule is never insult your audience. So instead of saying, as you know, you just say, we wanted to understand how the levels of protein were regulated. So we looked at transcription going from DNA to RNA and translation going from RNA to protein, and to see if it was blocked at one of these steps. We also looked at degradation of the mRNA and degradation of the protein. So I've given them the information they need. It's pretty basic in my field, but it was really critical to my story. Timing. The rough guideline is 1 to 2 minutes per slide. The pace, you want to keep it consistent, but not monotone. You want to show excitement and emphasis when appropriate, but not when inappropriate, because that's confusing. Okay, so you want to emphasize, you want to show your excitement, you want to show your engaged, how you are engaged in the material, but you don't want to be confusing about it. Don't be afraid of pauses or silences. These pauses seem really long when you're up front of the room or talking in front of an audience. For your audience, especially if it's a complicated subject, those pauses give them enough time to catch up with you mentally. Don't be afraid of ums and ahs. A little bit of that is okay. If it's interrupting your speech a lot, then that becomes a problem. Approximately 50% of your audience are not native English speakers, especially in a larger setting, or maybe you're not a native English speaker. So we need to practice speaking clearly, enunciating, not going too fast. And know what you do when you're nervous. And I put this in timing because a lot of people, when they're nervous, go really, really fast. And that's a problem because your audience can't keep up. So you need to practice. You need to practice out loud. So before you start, again, what is your main message? And you want 1, maybe 2 take one. General audience, specialized or who your audience is, a general or a specialized audience. You can try to assume complete ignorance and complete intelligence or brilliance of your audience, and no prior specialized knowledge. And then stick to your time limit. This is hard. It means you have to prioritize, but it's important because we've all been in that talk that goes on and on and on, and you have somewhere to be, and you're tired because you've been listening to someone for a long time. So it's really important to prioritize what you want to say. Then you should practice out loud, practice, and then I put maybe practice again. And that's because some people, if they practice too many times, they memorize it, becomes like a script, and then it sounds like you're just reading, and that's harder to listen to when you're in the audience. So how do you organize your talk? So first you start with why should you care, and the you being the audience. Why should your audience care? And then you give the background, which is what you need to know to understand the rest of the talk. This is not showing off your knowledge of everything biochemistry, for example. It's just what you need to know. So you start off really broad. Then you go to the substance, the meat of the talk, which starts with a question or a hypothesis or an objective. Then a rationale. So why do we care about this question, this particular question in this particular way? The approach or the method, so how the question was addressed, and then the results, which is what we found. And then what we found starts the process cycle again to a question. So this layers on your questions. A lot of people will present a talk like a paper where they have all their methods in one spot. The problem is by the time you get to the experiment that used that method, the audience no longer remembers what the method was. So it's better to put that method immediately before the results as part of this package. And then you want to conclude. So what does what you found mean in the context of the original hypothesis? Did you answer the hypothesis? Did you validate it or not? Did you succeed in what you were set out to do? And then future directions can be what you're going to do, or can be the obvious questions that have arisen from this research. Future directions may or may not be included. You have to really know what your purpose is before you include those. Okay, so in the introduction, we want to know what we know and what we don't know. What we don't know is really hard for early junior scientists, especially because you feel like everybody else knows everything and you know nothing. So it's really important to talk to your supervisor or someone more experienced to really understand what we don't know. Then why we care, so the significance, the objective, so what you're trying to do, and in my field, we really want an overall hypothesis. So this was mine. The RAS pathway negatively regulates the interferon system. And an overview of the approach, so like a big picture approach. I'm going to adjust this by doing these kinds of experiments, these kind of data analysis. And scientists don't like surprises. There shouldn't be a punchline or some sort of, hook at the end or surprise. You can do this in two ways. You can, if it's complicated, sometimes you can put your main conclusions or your model first. So you say, this is what I found, and now I'm going to show you how I came to those conclusions. Some people don't really like that. What most commonly and what more people like is to build the model. So you lead your audience down the same path that you took to come to the conclusions that you came to, and then they can agree with you or not. Do you include an outline? I say include an outline for talk longer than 30 minutes, but shorter than that, you just don't have enough time. But they need to be meaningful and useful. So this was an example of an outline that I used. So we have, I'm going to talk to you about these pathways, interferon RAS. Then I'm going to show you the regulation of STAT2 by RAS. Then we're going to talk about transcription versus stability and so on. That's, in my opinion, is the space. If you say that I'm going to first tell you about the introduction or background. Then I'm going to go over the methods. Then I'm going to go over the results. Then I'm going to go over the conclusion. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, I sure hope so, because it's a scientific talk. And if you don't tell me all of these things, I won't be able to follow. So this is obvious. You don't have to say. This is not obvious. So something useful, something that help you with your talk. This was, I used this kind of outline idea. I changed it to a summary of results to help map out my talk. So these two conclusions I had already shown all the data for. Now I'm showing this third conclusion I had just shown the data for. So reduced stat levels cause blah, blah, blah. And then that leads me to a new question. And then if I answer this question, then in my next summary of results, I'll gray out number 3 and have a new conclusion for number 4. So something like that is really helpful to your audience. Your results slides. I always like to have a title or a conclusion. In my title, I like to have a conclusion or a question. So if somebody gets lost partway through, or starts thinking about what they want to make for supper, or any sorts of things that can happen as an audience member, they can just read that and they can relocate themselves to where you are in the talk. The slides, I put S here, tried to emphasize S. This is not necessarily one slide, okay? This can be a set of slides. So the next point you want to make is the rationale for the experiment, the objective of the experiment, and the approach. And I really suggest using flowcharts or models or schematics. Words for the approach are often very difficult to follow. And then your result, of course, and then your conclusion, and then your interpretation, which often you can return to either your model that's in, potentially, depending on how you set it up, in your approach or in your main model for your entire question. And if you have complexity, which we do, we need to add it in layers. The science is hard enough. We don't need to make the visuals harder as well. And then we want to include a summary slide at the end, so our audience, even if they kind of didn't quite catch some of what we were saying earlier, can catch up with that summary slide. This was my main model for my talk, and hopefully, even though you probably, or who knows if you know any of this information, this is a pretty narrow field, but hopefully you can tell that I'm looking at this pathway and I'm asking a question about this pathway inhibiting this pathway. So I take this idea and I carry it forward into my results slide. So now this is a results slide, which doesn't look like it yet. What I'm saying is I'm going to address this question by treating this pathway with an inhibitor that's going to block the action of this protein, and then I'm going to ask the question if it blocks the action. And we think this protein is blocking the action of this protein, and you can see it gets complicated quite fast. So we're actually expecting an increase. And then I show my complicated data, and I go through one at a time to say, see, you don't see any bands here. You see a strong band there, a weak band there, and a strong band there. And if I was confident as an audience this was important, I would do this more carefully. And so that's one piece of data. And then I'm going to animate in the next piece of data to say, also STAT1 has the same effects on its phosphorylation. Then, because I don't have enough time, instead of showing the data, I'm just going to say we also looked at the genes and we saw those were regulated as expected. We also used siRNA to knock down this pathway, and we saw the results as expected. So this allows the audience to look at the results at exactly the same time they're looking at the model. There's no remembering. And I cannot expect my audience to remember something that I've told them if it's this complicated. So then you come to the conclusions. So usually we want to back out. What does this mean, audience member? Did you answer the question you set out to ask? and those future directions or new questions, again, depending on the purpose of your talk. This was my big summary slide. I wanted to put it all in one. So this was the pathway that I've been talking. So I had introduced this already, okay, at the very beginning, and animated it in so we could see the pathway being activated as we went through each of the proteins. And then this thing got released and activated it here. Now I'm showing I expressed this particular protein, and it had all of these results. We knocked down that gene, and that gene, and those genes, and that gene. Oops. And this in one picture gives the big take-home message for my talk. So the more you can use pictures, the better your audience will be able to understand your point. You always want to end with an acknowledgement. Normally, we acknowledge our scientific contributors, so your PI, your lab members, your collaborators. You always want to acknowledge your funding agencies. Many of them write this into the agreement with you, but obviously it's critical. You depend on the situation, but usually you don't acknowledge your friends and family. The only exception to that, I would say, is in a thesis defense, where that is, part of that whole ending of this big part of your career, this big culmination of everything you've done. Then it's really important to say thank you. Thank you, and I'll take any questions. Because if you don't, then your audience doesn't know when you're done. They don't know when to clap. This social agreement between you and your audience gets confusing. So you just say thank you, and then everybody knows to clap, and everybody knows there's a question and answer. Okay, but I'm not done. So let's talk about slide content. I can't tell you how to make your slides, but I can tell you you need to evaluate your slides critically with an outside eye. If you can't, you ask someone else to. You want to keep it simple, right? I already said this. The science is complicated enough. Your slides shouldn't be. Keep everything as much as you can in short phrases, not full sentences. You don't want people reading your slides all the time. You want them listening to what you're saying. And everything important is on that slide. I really suggest you recreate diagrams to illustrate your point. There are a lot of really wonderful diagrams or schematics out there. Most of the time, they either have too much or not enough for what you want to say, because you're only giving the information that your audience needs for your talk. And I'll just point out this website, biorender.com, has all these great images that you can just pull. They are very professional looking. And use your slides as a memory aid. Okay, so don't read out the slides. Try to just let whatever's popping up on the slide, jog your memory. This is what I want to say. The exception to that is if you do read a sentence, you want to do that in a way that's purposeful, because it can be really impactful when you read the sentence along with your audience. And I said this, diagrams and flowcharts and pathways, as much as you can, not text. I'm obviously breaking this rule. I don't know how to put a lot of these things into pictures, but if you, at the beginning, I did have some pictures just to break up the text. And we want it to be aesthetically pleasing. We want things to line up. We want to have lots of nice colors. So talking about colors, the most important thing is clarity. So we want to have nice contrasts. We want to keep in mind that some people are red-green colorblind, so try not to use those as a big, to discriminate. And consistency. So this is a terrible background, right? It's confusing, it's complicated, it's really busy, and it's distracting from the slide content. If you have logos, I hear some, okay, never mind. If you have some logos on the cells, because it gets really busy really fast. on an acknowledgement slide, this is perfect. This is an example of a watermark background. Really don't do it. I did this as my title slide, which is a really straightforward title slide, and they've already seen the title in the seminar announcement. And in the next slide, I wanted to show where I had been during my career. And so this became from a watermark background to a easily seen background. This kind of stuff you can do on your title slide and your acknowledgement slide. Okay, when you're talking, you want to have transitions between slides and ideas. So you use words like having shown that, whatever. Next, we considered whether to investigate this this means that. So these transition slides these transition sentences link one idea to the other. So you can have slides that actually say this and show this, and that's great. When I say transition slides, I don't mean when you have slides flying in and flying out and spinning around. We're going to talk about that. You can use humor to wake up your audience. Sometimes right around this point, your audience is getting a little tired. So I have a cartoon here showing that this person has some really great data to increase performance over 0.0001%. And it turns out she's practicing her talk to her pillows. As a rule, you don't want to start off with a joke, your first slides. It can fall really flat because you haven't established any rapport between you and your audience. Fonts, my rule is 24 point or more. Sort of changes now in this online environment because people's screens are going to be different sizes. You want to be consistent. If you use bolds or shadows, you need to do it purposefully. So something needs to be bold on purpose. In generally, we like sans serif fonts for presentations and serif fonts for pages of text. So serif is those little dealy things that come off of like the T's here in Times New Roman. And then Arial and Helvetica are examples of sans serif fonts that really stand out better for presentations. A font like Comic Sans MS can be, some people like it and some people don't. If you are going to use it, know that this is coming across much less formally than these other fonts. If that's your point, if that's your purpose, then use it. Just use it purposefully. You want to use animations sparingly. You can see I've used them. You need a good reason. So if you only have a few bullet points, you don't need to animate. If you have a lot of bullet points, you do. If you have a complicated pathway, you definitely need to animate. And depending on how complicated your design is, you may or may not want to animate. But if you're animating every little thing, your audience gets irritated. And never make those animations that those GIFs, like that if something is moving the entire time. That is horrible as an audience member because you can't keep your attention away from that. So animated slide transitions, just don't do it. Don't have your things zooming in and zooming out. It's really distracting. And I'm gonna give you one exception. So this is from a talk where somebody was talking about a rat brain. So they're showing the rat. Now they're showing that same view, but inside the brain. Now this is the top of the brain, the side, the bottom, the front, and then a diagram of the regions and an explanation of what region they're going to talk about. That worked, and it was purposeful, and it was meaningful. Okay, techniques. Own the room. You're up there. Everybody's watching you. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to apologize. I mean, you do something funny and you should apologize, but don't sound apologetic when you're giving your talk. Just give it. You want to avoid meta commentary. This is the commentary that you're going, oh, oops, that text isn't formatted correctly. It's talking about your talk. And hopefully you've practiced enough that you don't need to do that, but it also is very distracting to your message. The laser pointer and the mouse. So it is common with both the laser pointer and the mouse just to, move them around, circling. Heard of this line. It's a problem. It's very distracting. So take your hands away, put your laser pointer down, or you know, just try to minimally use it with purpose. Eye contact with your audience is important. When we don't have an audience, your eye contact with your camera is important. It's extraordinarily difficult. Know your tics. I once went to a talk where somebody was rocking back and forth on this platform, and it had been a platform made out of plywood, and it was squeaky. And this was her tic. She was rocking back and forth, and it squeaked the entire time. And you actually couldn't hear her because of the squeaking. So if you're like that, be aware of it and try not to do it if it's going to be distracting, but also just know that that's maybe what you're going to do and to control it. You want to be confident, but not arrogant. Most people have a hard time with the confident. But you know, when you're talking about your work, you really are the expert. If you don't know something, it is fine to say you don't know something. Know your tools. So we've all been in a talk where somebody wants to go back to a slide and they just go back, and it goes back all through the animations. That's really hard as an audience member. So if PowerPoint, you can just go by title, and you can, I don't know if you guys can see this, but you can see the slide, and you can go straight back to the slide. You can escape the slideshow, and you can go back to it there. Using your advancer easily, you know, we have these in person, these remote advancers, so they forward and backwards, and sometimes you push a different button and everything goes black. So you need to know that. We want to prevent updates or notifications. So an update like this might be a little embarrassing. An update like that is going to be a lot embarrassing. So PowerPoint automatically blocks them, but if you're using something else, or it doesn't block Slack, so you can still get Slack notifications, you want to be sure to close those. And then sharing your screen. Once I shared my screen and it was like the presentation screen and no, like the presenter view, and I didn't realize that. And so knowing what screen you're sharing is really important. That's hard, but you have to practice your tools. Everybody gets nervous. So what do? Well, I use it. So once I wasn't nervous and I feel like I gave the worst talk. So you can use it to give you energy. If it's too much, you can use breathing techniques. Obviously, practice is going to make a difference. You know, once I started teaching 3 days a week for 10 weeks in a row, talking in public got easier because I did it so much. So experience. And if it's really hard, you know, there is public speaking courses. So this person, you know, is asking if she's ready for her talk. She has everything, even transparencies, which I don't even know that you could get something to put those on. But she's so nervous, the butterflies in her stomach are throwing up. So yeah, it's hard. You just have to try to work through it. So just some final thoughts. What is your message? So you have to know that. You want clear communication. You want simple, straightforward visuals as best as you can. Go to as many presentations as you can, even if they're not in your field, especially maybe if they're just a little bit away from your field, because you'll be able to understand what it is about the presentation that made you miss something, or maybe it was really great, like this wasn't your field, but you understood it because this person presented it so well. Try and take notes of all those. Try and take note of all of those things. You do want to prepare early. There's nothing worse than having a presentation that's rushed, giving the presentation and realizing all these things, all these mistakes that you made. So you want to give yourself enough time. And then tell them what you're going to say. Tell them. And then tell them what you said. So with that, I'm going to leave you with some other resources. Like I said, you can download this presentation from my website, so you certainly don't need to write those down. And then I would just like to acknowledge the people in my life that have helped me develop some of these ideas. So my PhD supervisor, both my postdoc supervisors, past students and lab mates where we've talked about these things, and online colleagues with similar interests who also write on these topics. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Christian. I really appreciate it. It's funny, there's a couple of things that really spoke to me. Even though I'm like you, I've taught tons of classes and, presented feels like a million times, but the as you know, or clearly everyone knows this, sort of trying to build a rapport and not make yourself look stupid for actually talking about this is really can be really insulting. And I was on the other end of that, attending one of these talks that I wasn't as familiar with in the, it was just outside my area. And someone kept saying that over and over, more like probably a nervous habit, quite frankly. But I remember thinking, my God, that's the reason you shouldn't say it. I'm the person.
I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I know. And the other thing that really spoke to me, I think, is the saying it out loud um, before you present. My postdoc supervisor told me that trick, and it has saved me because what you think in your head is not necessarily what's going to come out of your mouth. And
Yeah.
so having some experience and it really highlights the sticking points in your presentation when you actually have to say
Mhm.
the words. And so for me, that was those two things were eye-opening and funny that you picked up. Well, I guess they're good tips, so of course you would. Um, so anybody have any questions? So I think the website we just mentioned.
So is my website, so if you search my name and mine, I'm the first hit in Google. Or if you go to the Department of Biochemistry website under our faculty, it'll be right there.
Well, I have a question actually. And so as and I don't know that this is necessarily because I'm female, but oftentimes when I give scientific presentations, I'm questioned by someone who maybe thinks that they might know a little, they're a little aggressive in the way they question, or um, I'm just wondering if you have any tips, and even from my own, even to this day, any tips with dealing with questioners who maybe are not as respectful, or
Mm.
like, is it better just to cut them off, or should you entertain them? I don't know how to deal with in those
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. So how I think of it, well, so you own the room. You are the one in charge. And so, yes, let them try and get their question out. But if they go on and on, then you say, well, let me try and answer that first part of your question first. And then if they continue on, hopefully you have a moderator who is really good and they can cut them off. Um, but yeah, I think you do. You cut them off if you have to, and you say, let me try to answer that before we get too complicated. The hardest thing though is that emotional response when somebody's being really aggressive. And so I try really hard when I'm in that situation to really focus on the content of what they're saying. Try to push away the emotion and just say, okay, just gonna answer the question that they're asking. I'm gonna try to figure out what they're asking, and then just don't take it personally, which is hard.
Yeah, the not taking it personally and not thinking about it over and over, ruminating about it over and over in your head later on
Yeah.
is a skill too. Yeah, thanks. Someone, Rebecca mentioned that offering to answer their question after the talk. Yeah, they tend to be less aggressive when they don't have an audience for sure. And so that's a
Yeah,
really good tip too.
that's a good idea.
Rebecca, Bennett, you had a question? You can turn your camera on if you'd like, if you're more comfortable. Yep, perfect. But you don't have to.
Hello.
Hi.
So just like something that I wanted to ask purely out of curiosity, but also a comment that I have picked up over the years of giving presentations in classes and other affairs. But there is like a whole psychology behind colors and how they make you feel. And marketing and business teams use this strategy very often in their advertisements. So I was just wondering, what colors do you think are the most appealing in a presentation?
That's a good question. I think that's depends on the field what kind of answer you're going to get. When I teach, I use a white text background and black. Students are printing these things out, and I don't want to, make them waste ink. In other situations, I do like to use like a light blue background usually. I find that that has a nice contrast to a lot of other colors. Um, I've heard that it's best from a visual perspective to use a black background with white text. It certainly makes the text jump out, but I do find that my eyes kind of get tired from looking at that over a long period, a long talk. Um, I don't know the psychology behind color, so that would be really interesting. I'll have to look into that some more.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or suggestions or issues people have had?
Well, I
I
have a
know.
question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what's the worst part about giving a talk? How do people feel about that? What's the worst thing that just makes you so nervous about giving a talk? Does anybody have any?
Anybody have any comments? Getting started? Yeah.
Yeah, getting started, getting motivated to do that. So I find that I just put something together. And even if I have like an old talk, I just put some slides in. It might not look the same at all at the end, but at least editing can be easier than starting from a blank slate. Yeah.
Those few minutes before, yeah, they're brutal.
Hmm.
I remember a colleague of mine, a senior colleague of mine, and saying he threw up every single time he gave a class. He went to class. He used to go to the bathroom first and come and give to his lecture. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I think I would have retired or found a new field. But yeah, for 20 years or something. Mm.
Yeah. I find that when I'm giving a talk in person, I like, you go in the room early, you get set up, and then I go to the bathroom just because I need like a quiet moment to myself to kind of keep it together. Yeah.
Completely blank page on my mind. Yeah. uh, Waiting to give the talk. Can someone or get someone? So Kelly suggests getting someone to read your slides for spelling and grammar errors. It is very distracting as an audience, and I agree with that. I think be making sure things line up, making sure your bullet points are all in line, and some of the fancier versions you can change so that how things are aligned and it throws it off, and I find it really distracting too. So I would agree with Kelly there. uh, I found the laser pointer was tricky for me until someone told me to hold my elbow against my body and then use the laser pointer, because I would look like I had like a neurological problem
If
with
you
the
were really nervous,
yeah.
yeah.
That's tell for me is is shaking, and so if anyone else uses the laser pointer, I recommend putting your arm against your body and holding your elbow. It helps. The fear to forget everything for the nervousness. Hmm.
So this is why you have everything on your slide. And it doesn't have to be all of the words that you're going to say, but it's just a little hint. It could be even like a sun to remember that's bright idea, anything like that. So when I teach, when I used to teach in person, we used to have clicker questions, and I always forget when to have the clicker question. So finally, I just put this image of an emoticon who's thinking, and every time I say that, now I have to ask a clicker question. So it's just these things that are going to trigger your memory. But you do have to practice it enough that you link the memory aid to the idea.
I think that's a great point. We have a question from Trina, I believe. What is the best way, or how should you respond to questions you might not necessarily know the answer to?
Well, that is a great question. And so let me repeat that question. So how do you answer a question that you don't know the answer to? Well, you bide time, like I just did. Okay. And then you say, I don't really know that answer, or I think somebody knows that answer, but it's not me right now. I just can't place it. You try not to do that too much in like an exam situation, obviously. You can say, well, what you're asking is this other aspect that's also relevant. Now that's how the politicians answer all of their questions, right? They just answer the question they were hoping you would ask. But don't be afraid to say, I just don't know. And if it's a situation where you can come back to that person, you can say, I'm going to look into that because that's a really great question, and let me get back to you. So it's a hard thing to say, I don't know.
It is. And even no matter how far along you are, you don't know. And so that the expectation is for the presenter not to know every single answer. And so don't feel bad about that. I know my biggest stress is having someone else in the room who knows more than I do. I'm always anxious about that if I'm presenting to a really knowledgeable field. But that's part of it,
Yeah.
and just practice.
And I think sometimes you can take those opportunities, if you're not too nervous, you can take them and really learn from them, right? You can say, oh, that's a great thing. I had never considered that before. Maybe we can talk about it after the talk and really, use that.
So eye contact is important, as someone has said, for in-person presentations, but a good trick is to look at their eyebrows if you're uncomfortable looking in their eyes. That's a really good trick. I've seen the most seasoned scientists in the field get very nervous before their talk at a scientific meeting. Yep, that's
Yeah,
there.
being a good scientist doesn't equal being a good presenter or a comfortable presenter. Yeah.
No. Uh, Perfect. Any other questions or suggestions, comments?
It looks like someone has their hand up. I don't know if that's on
Oh,
purpose.
oh, I'm sorry. Jalissa?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say about seeing really the big wigs in my field going blank and really nervous and pale and to sweat just like right before their talks. It was like really a reminder that we all get very stressed about scientific presentations. And when we practice with my students, I always tell them this. Of course, they do not believe me. Like when I mention big names, and they're like, "No way, you've seen them almost passing." Yes. So I think it's just a good reminder, and also for our students, that it's okay to be nervous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's normal. And if you can use it, that's great. If you can just get through it, that's fine too.
It will not be your last presentation. So that's the other thing I keep thinking of. Next time I'll be better or I'll do things differently. And so if you see it sort of as a learning experience, then that's really helpful too. Okay, anyone else? Well, we are coming close to our hour, so oh, to try and practice calming techniques even when you're not presenting. If you incorporate breathing techniques, calming practices regularly, it will be easier to do them when you need to. That's a really great point, because it is hard to breathe slow when you're nervous. And so having that practice is critical. I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
And you should know yourself, right? Like I blush when I present and I get blotchy and uncomfortable. So when I'm really uncomfortable, I know to wear turtlenecks to presentations so that I'm covered as much as I can. If I could have worn a hat and a face mask now, it's perfect.
Now you can.
But know yourself, what makes you uncomfortable, and try to do your best. And in this particular world of virtual, make sure you know what's on your behind you so that you're not sort of embarrassed or uncomfortable as you're looking at the screen and realize there's, like, I don't know, a shelf of beer cans or something, and you're trying to give a professional presentation. So know your environment and know yourself, I guess. Given that everything is online, is it a big deal if students do not make eye contact with the camera and instead look at individuals on the screen?
It's so hard to look at the camera. Like I'm looking at it right now, so it probably feels like I'm looking at you, but all I see is this green dot. And so I think that and you do your best. But if I'm now looking at somebody at the chat function, now I'm looking away. I would suggest not to have two monitors though, when you're presenting, because I do see that. So if I have my presentation on my monitor over here, I'm always looking this way and I'm never even like face on to the audience. I think that can be really distracting. But
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, well, I think that seems to be it now. So I want to thank Dr. Christian, of course, for her great talk and the tips. As she said, it's posted on her website. It will also, a video of this, like I said, will also be posted on the Faculty of Science website. I'd also like to thank Kelly Foss for helping me with this initial setup, and hopefully going forward if this isn't too painful for her. And Lynn Frizzell, Dr. Lynn Frizzell also for coming up with ideas. Please, 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 if you have topics that you would like us to address, let us know. We are eager to keep this going and really just try and improve any aspect that you may be struggling with. And so thank you all for coming and enjoy your lunch. Thanks again. Thanks, Dr. Christian.
thanks. Bye.
Bye now.